Hello and welcome to this quick video about how to transform an analog quad into a digital HD quad. Now the stuff I'm going to talk about, we're going to talk about how to do it for things like walk snail, DJI systems and also HD02, because the stuff that you need to know about what needs to be on the quad are the same for each of those systems. They're fundamentally the same in terms of needing power, typically battery power from somewhere, and also needing a couple of connections to the flight controller to populate the on-screen display. Now I've just recently changed this Recon 6 over from the analog setup that was in here to be walk snail. So I've just gone through the whole process and I asked my patrons, should I do a video showing the 4 or 5 things that you need to check on your model before you actually go ahead with this? Because if there are 4 or 5 things that you can tick all the boxes for, then the walk snail, DJI or HD0 installation becomes pretty straightforward. And the answer from those patrons was a big yes. So a big thank you to Roddy, Carl, Henning, Matthew, Scott, Robert, Big Blue Chopper, Leon, Mick, John, Christian and Alan for coming back to me and saying, yes, please. This video, gentlemen, is for you. So with a closer up look here on the bench at this Recon 6 that I've just converted, let's talk about the 5 or 6 things that you need to be able to have on the model in order to do a conversion up to HD. The first and foremost, I guess, is the fact that there needs to be room for the HD system to fit. Originally, when this Recon 6 was delivered, it had an analog system here at the back, and that consisted of a little Zeus HGLRC VTX with a nice long antenna, and it had an analog camera in the front. And there were lots and lots of room in the back to mount something like a HD system. You can see here it actually fits in quite nicely. And this is a very common way with a lot of frames that have the middle section where you have something like a flight controller to give you enough room at the back in order for it to fit. So for example, here's another GEP RC model that has kind of a similar layout where you have the camera at the front, you have the flight controller and ESCs, and then you have the HD system at the back. The only thing about this is you have to be careful how far away the HD system is from the camera, as the cable is only a certain length and it only is just long enough on this long frame. The last way that's quite common is to have it above the flight stack. This is the Cinebot 30. We have the flight controller at the top here, and you can see the DJI Air unit is actually at the bottom. So it's in kind of a mini stack. Usually there is an option to mount something like this, and that option is taken up by the analog system that's already in the model. If you have that kind of space available, then that's a good place to start. Couple of extra things on that. Lots of the VTX units these days have some kind of mounting holes. This V2 unit, this Avatar walk snail unit, has screw holes at 20mm mountings, which is quite a common hole size that's drilled into frames for these auxiliary pieces. And when they are like that, you can actually mount the HD unit using those 20mm spacers. If you don't, then you will probably have to make sure that there is some way that you can attach it. Double-sided foam isn't a great idea because these run quite warm, and I would always try and make it so there's some air both underneath and above, because they do run quite warm and they do like a little bit of airflow to keep cool. The other thing to be aware of is the size of the camera for the frame that you have. Most of the cameras for the HD systems are kind of 19mm sizes. There are obviously mini and micro versions, but do remember to check that as well. Second thing you'll need on the model is a spare UART to connect the HD system into in order for the on-screen display to be sent. Because the way all of these kind of systems work, whether it's your Avatar or something like the DJI system, is that the flight controller via the UART will send telemetry information, typically MSP telemetry or multi-serial protocol telemetry, into the HD system, and then it will typically be then created in the goggles themselves. So you need a way to get that information from the flight controller into the unit, and that is where these 2 of these 4 wires are being used for. Now, how do you know if you have a spare UART on the flight controller? Well, older F4 baseboards, some of the cheaper CPUs, won't have very many UARTs at all, and you need a spare UART that's currently not doing anything. The easiest way to do it is plug your flight controller into Betaflight, go into the ports tab for the current configuration and see if there is a spare port available. Now you might be able to reuse the port that's currently used for something like SmartPort or Tramp to actually run the VTX to change the power band and frequency. However, on some flight controllers, they don't have a full UART with a transmit and receive pair. To do things like that, they kind of cheap it out and they just have an individual pad. So when you find a UART that's potentially spare, then have a look on the flight controller on the wiring schematic to make sure that that is available. Now the nice thing is that the DJI system can work from a soft serial. However, in my testing here, the walk snail definitely won't, and the HD Zero system, I'd use a hardware UART for that as well. So for me, I would always go with a hardware UART if at all possible. Some modern flight controllers, like this one that's in here, this is the F722, this is the HGLRC flight controller here, have an individual dedicated cable to run the DJI HD system. Just because it says for the DJI HD system doesn't mean that it can only run that. It can absolutely run anything, because that's where this avatar unit is plugged into. And that gives me both my power and ground, but also my transmit and receive pair for that UART. Just happens to be UART 4 on this particular model. So now we've talked about having the space and having a spare UART. What else do you need? Well, you also need a way to power the unit safely. Most of these bigger units are going to have a voltage range that's typically going to be happy with a flight battery. Now be careful with 6S packs for some of the bigger ones. You have to be very careful, particularly things like walk snail. I hear regularly of people blowing up walk snails when they're using 6S on something like a quad, where a voltage spike will pretty much destroy the whole thing and cook it. However, if you're using 2, 3, 4S, then you can power it all simply. Again, flight controllers that have a HD port on them to run a HD FPV system will normally supply a clean, regulated voltage out with enough current to run these, because you need a couple of amps to run these kind of systems. This one on this quad produces 9 volts. So in that port, we get 9 volts, we get the ground pin, we also get the receive and transmit, and because it's a DJI system, there are 2 other cables too. Now, if it doesn't have a voltage output like that, you can just piggyback the voltage from the battery terminals on the flight controller, and that's the way that I've done it in other places. In wings, I tend to do that via a JST lead that goes into the Avatar or DJI system. That way it allows me to power everything up, and then when the system is powered and the GPS has a lock, come onto the GPS in a moment, then I can power up the HD system and we're all ready to go. The last thing that I would recommend that you do is that you make sure that you can get your flight controller upgraded to one of the latest versions of the software that's available. I'd recommend Betaflight 4.4 or later, or iNav 6.0 or later. Both of those are designed to run any of the HD systems really well, so whichever you have in here, you can kind of set it up. However, there are a couple of wrinkles in Betaflight that I will go through, because what we're really talking about here is setting this up on a quad. Check the links down below if you're interested in setting up things like walk snail on a wing. I've done that a lot. So here on my Recon 6, how have I kind of ticked all those boxes? Well, I obviously had enough room at the back here after I took out my analog equipment, which was kind of just down here at the bottom. There was absolutely loads of room, and the air unit or the Avatar unit I'm using has 20mm mounting holes, so that made that piece of cake. The next thing I need to do was find a spare UART. Again, this is one of those quads that was available in both an analog and a HD version, so they've used a flight controller with a HD FPV port. That port is designed for DJI, and I've just plugged a cable into that, and that's given me my ground, 9 volts, transmit and receive pair, and that also gives me a spare UART that I can use to send the on-screen display information. And that means then I don't have to worry about powering it. The flight controller can do all that goodness for me. And I can update it to Betaflight 4.4. Now, talking about Betaflight, there are a couple of things that you need to do in order to get the walk snail system working. the UART that you have connected the transmit and receive pair to. And again, don't forget the transmit pin on the Avatar or DJI or HD0 unit goes to the receive pin on the flight controller and vice versa. So it's receive to transmit, transmit to receive. And then what you need to do is go into the ports tab. You need to select MSP display port. And then once you've done that, go into the hub and click on HD and drag your elements around to the position that you want. And lastly, you need to go into the CLI and set the display port type as MSP. Now there are settings and setups that you can kind of click that will do that for you automatically. But if you do all those three things, then your on-screen display will appear. So now we've talked about how you can convert your analog copter to something like the HD system. What else is there to talk about? Well, not a lot really, because if you've got that far and you've got it all fitted, then you're in good shape. A couple of pro tips to finish off. First one is do update and bind the Avatar or the DJI unit to the version of firmware that you need before you install it into the model, because doing it afterwards is just a little bit trickier. It's easier to do it while it's out the model. You can power it. You can also keep it nice and cool. I have a little fan that run on them on the bench while I'm doing the updating because it can get warm. Second thing is do make sure that you're installing the camera the right way round. On the Avatar walk-snail system, the cable goes in at the bottom. On the DJI system, there's usually some kind of little arrow, hopefully that's appearing on the camera, that shows you the way up. I know quite a few people, myself included, that have been so busy routing the cables around and trying to get everything fitted that they've managed to install the camera upside down, and you only realise that when you bind it to the goggles. And the last point I'm going to give you here is about GPSs. Now, HD FPV systems are notorious for affecting how well a GPS performs. If I put this GPS right by the side of this unit, or the HD0 or DJI unit, there is a possibility that one of the harmonic frequencies for all the digital signals being processed inside these little computers will affect this GPS. Now, the GPS is listening to satellites miles and miles above in orbit around the Earth, and the signal it receives is incredibly small, so it doesn't take much to upset it. I would recommend that you physically separate your GPS and your HD system as much as you possibly can. I haven't been able to here, but I've actually tested it and it's working fine. The way I would recommend that you test it is with the FPV HD system unpowered, unsolder the positive wire and power everything up, and make sure you can get a GPS lock, have it plugged into the Betaflight configurator. If that all works, and then when you connect the power to the VTX unit and then power it back up and connect it again, that GPS lock never appears. Even though you're getting a valid signal from the GPS, you never get a 3D lock. That's an indicator that you're getting interference. You can shield it using things like slivers of moo metal, but your best bet is to physically separate the GPS from where it is on the model. And I would personally recommend always having something like a GPS on a model like this. Two things: I'd like to have my distance and direction to home. I also like my speed and altitude displayed in the on-screen display. But also with the Betaflight GPS Rescue, or if it's an iNav quad, the fantastic iNav return to home failsafe. It means that if something nasty does happen, then I don't lose 100 odd pounds of walk-snail, DJI or HD system, along with whichever action camera I've got along with a quad. So there you have it. Those are the things that you need to check. And I'm very pleased to say that this one has gone together really nicely. I now have a walk-snail quad, and the whole reason for me making walk-snail quads here are that occasionally I'll be doing reviews of things that are DJI, and I will have my buddy flying those for the following shots when they're flying in the air, and I need then something, if they've got my DJI goggles on, I need to be able to pop my walk-snail goggles on and do the follow-along images, because everyone loves that stuff. But now with something like this, I can absolutely do that. So hopefully that helps those of you who are interested in this. It actually isn't difficult, but it only works if you can tick all of those boxes on the model that you're about to convert. If you can't, then things can get a little bit more complicated, or you have to do things like sacrifice your OSD. Thank you for watching the video. If you watch my videos and find them useful, then please take a moment to hit the like and subscribe button. It helps the channel a lot. If you really like what I'm doing here, you can become a Patreon and support the time I spend helping others and get access to lots of exclusive benefits. Link is in the video description. Remember that all the videos on the channel are organised into playlists, so you can easily use those playlists to find all the videos on a subject that you are interested in. Add Painless 360 to your searches on Google and YouTube, and it'll help you find my content for any particular topic. Thanks again for watching, and as always, happy flying.